Many times, grievers can be overwhelmed with racing thoughts. On today's episode, we have a great tool to help, so stay tuned.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Grief is overwhelming. We say that it's big. Grief is full of feelings, changes, so many changes, and so many secondary losses. We know that grief work can be exhausting, frustrating, and painful because all of these thoughts and feelings and secondary losses, they just come at us. They just fly at us constantly like racing thoughts. And oftentimes the griever just wants the brain to stop, just slow down, give me a break. Today, we're going to talk about a coping skills strategy to help the brain slow down and at times even help the brain pause these racing thoughts. So today, one of our grief counselors, Hannah, is here with me. Hello, Hannah.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to be here.
So when we say racing thoughts, just saying that sentence makes my body and my mind react because I think we've all had times when our brain has been stressed and it just races and races and races. I know even for me, just last week, my to-do list was so big. And because it was so big, I only had half of it written down, which is not normal for me. And my brain knew that. And it was stressed, and it was constantly sending me messages about all the things that I had to do and all the things that, hey, Angela, this isn't even on the list. This isn't on the list. And it was causing me to be irritable, and I was second-guessing myself. And then I just wasn't even using the to-do list, which is not normal for me. And it was so stressful because my brain would not stop with all these thoughts.
Well, we know everyone gets racing thoughts, and I feel like they're just bigger when we're grieving. They're harder to stop. They can be more intense. And a part of my racing thoughts, I get a certain type of racing thought where I'll get something that feels like it's on a loop. I'm thinking about the same thing over and over and over. So maybe that to-do list is everything on the list, and then I'm running through that list over and over and over. Or what I will do sometimes too is I'll make up some scenarios in my mind, and I'll have a movie where the rest of the world doesn't know the lyrics or the lines, and I've got the script only in my head, and I'm making up some scenarios based off something small that's happened in my day. And I think that can be something that's really common for grievers, those what ifs and those scenarios.
Right. So racing thoughts, that's just a normal thing that many of us deal with. When stress goes high, racing thoughts go high. Then we add grief to the mix. And let's just be clear that racing thoughts with grief is an expected normal symptom because your brain is stuck on the events of what in the world has happened. Maybe you were a long-term caregiver. Maybe the death was sudden. And in an instant, without any knowledge, your life changed. Your brain doesn't know what to do with that. I like to say that our brain is like a file cabinet, and the file cabinet is full of all these files that we've created, all these experiences we've had. We know what to do. We know how to cope. We know maybe which coping skill to pull out when this happens. But when there's a sudden death, we don't know. When there's a loss in general, even if you have grieved another loss, you don't know how to grieve this person. And so I look at it as we have to create a file. And so in the process of doing that, all of these thoughts are flooding us, all of these thoughts are racing, and that's where the stress comes in even more because of the grief.
Right. And I think that's so important that you hit on how normal this is, because it feels really abnormal to have all of these grief reactions, all these feelings, right? And then we're also in body experiences and spiritual experiences. We know that grief is that whole body experience, but those feelings sometimes feel so intense, paired with these cognitive reactions of these racing thoughts. And then we're also dealing with these secondary losses, all these changes in our life due to this death. And so with all of this on our plate, when our brain is going a million miles an hour and our thoughts are racing, we want to kind of match that pace of our thoughts with our healing, I think. I think we sometimes want to rush through and say, okay, I've got to grieve well, I've got to heal, I've got to do this and this, and these are all the ways I'm supposed to grieve, but our heart moves so much slower than our brain. And so giving ourselves that grace, giving ourselves that permission to know that we cannot do this in a one-time decision. This is a practice, really a daily practice, working on our grief, expressing our feelings, and certainly spending time with just slowing down that brain.
So let's talk about what some racing thoughts might be.
So racing thoughts, they're often, they spin out in our brain. They play over and over, and it's on a loop, like we said. So grieving people often have these loops or these repetitive thoughts that are racing. Maybe it's about the death. Maybe it's about the day the person died, what we experienced through our senses, what we saw, what we heard, what we smelled, all of those sensory moments. Those can play over and over and over. Or maybe it's who told us about the death or delivered the news. That can play over and over. And then maybe some stressors going on in our life that were caused by the grief. Now my to-do list has tripled in size because my person isn't here to do what they were doing. Or maybe it's really just a memory, right? Your last phone call with your person, the last time you saw them. And in some instances, that's pleasant to sit with in a way. In other instances, that's really, really painful to feel like we're stuck in that loop.
Right. Racing thoughts are exhausting. Even though our brain is racing and that exhausts us physically, maybe it's keeping us up awake at night, but it also impacts our mood, those racing thoughts do. We may get grumpy. So we really need a coping skill because, like you said, it can be so distressing to have all these thoughts coming at you and it's impacting you maybe physically, cognitively, emotionally, and it's like, what in the world do I do with this? So we like to think about a coping skills toolbox. That's kind of how we use that, with the folks that we work with. Like, we have a toolbox. We need to put different tools in them. Not every tool works for every grief reaction. Sometimes what's been working for maybe the last 6 months, that can be distressing because all of a sudden it doesn't really work. It's not the one I need. And so that's the purpose of this episode today, is to put out another coping skill that you can have in your toolbox, but that you have to take out, you have to try it, you have to befriend it, you have to use it. And so let's jump in and get into this coping skill.
Right. And this is definitely one of my favorites. I think that it's really helpful because you can do it anywhere, at any time, in the middle of the day, the middle of the night. And it is just what you were saying. It's a skill. So it's something that we practice. I know that if you don't take it out of the toolbox very often and don't use it very often, you're going to maybe get rusty on it. So this is definitely something that if, as we get into it, if it's something that the first try, it's not, the most effective, it's worth practicing this skill.
Well, let's jump in. It's one of my favorites too.
Okay, so we're thinking about our mind like a television, like a TV. And we want to be able to access all the different channels or all the different platforms. And we know that there are so many. If you're like me, you have way too many subscriptions and streaming platforms and all these things, and there can be overwhelming options. And that's a lot like our brains. And so we want to give ourselves the power, the control to be able to be in charge of what we're watching, what's running through our mind. So I often pretend like I have a remote control. Some people like to pretend it's in their hand. Some people like to picture the remote control in their mind. And just knowing that this gives me the power to change what I'm watching, to switch up the channel.
So the power is in the channel changing.
Yes, or thought switching. So we want to think of some of our favorite channels. So that could be comedy, sports, news, maybe home renovation, Hallmark movies. What are some of yours?
Oh, for me, the channels that are in my brain, even just right now, there's always a to-do list channel. I had a dear friend die recently, so there's a funeral channel. I've really been thinking a lot about that. And then actually, I've had a memory channel going lately because my brother's birthday is coming up. So, those might be some of my channels right now that are kind of coming at me with a lot of different thoughts.
And some of those are really difficult channels to sit with. And so a lot of people we see, or just a lot of people, that come to the center will tell us they have maybe just a general grief channel. It feels like it's all on one channel, or maybe more specific feelings like a regret channel or a joy channel. Our folks that talk to us and listen to our podcast know that we talk a lot about dosing, and that's what this is. This is a type of dosing. So you name some of the more difficult channels. What are maybe some new channels that you'd like to add, Angela?
I love a hiking channel. A peace channel sounds really nice. Actually, just a quiet channel sounds like that could be a great addition for me.
Those are great. And we know adding a channel is not about turning off our grief, or so certainly not making our grief go away. Adding channels is a tool, and it can help us. We can hold that remote and we can switch. So you can go from time with your grief channel or your memory channel when you want, because we know that is important, but maybe not in the middle of the night, maybe not when we have a big event the next day. Taking that control back with that remote control.
Right. And so that's really important to stress, is we know we need time with our grief channel. If the funeral channel is what you need to spend time with, we know we need that time. We just maybe don't need that time when we're at work or trying to be productive, or we're, trying to go to sleep, like you mentioned. A lot of times these types of channels try to play at night when we're trying to rest, and that might be where we need to hold that remote and really change the channel to maybe more of the peace channel.
And our grief channel, all those channels of maybe difficult emotions, they do need our attention. They're popping up in our minds and our hearts for a reason, because we know that grief needs processing, grief needs witnessing. We need to spend time with that. And so finding the time, I don't know, maybe in the morning when you're drinking your cup of coffee for 10 minutes, saying, okay, I have the time and I have the capacity right now to switch over to the funeral channel and give that a review, because I know this is so important for my grief.
Right. And then, so it's that permission piece, it sounds like, that we have to really give ourselves. And I think as grievers, we talk about that a lot here, is giving ourselves permission to switch the channel. Switching the channel doesn't mean that I'm over this. It doesn't mean that this is too hard, I'm not strong enough. All these types of messages we may give ourselves. What it really means is, I've sat with my grief, I've given my grief time, but now I need to change the channel because I need to get to work, or I need to get the kids up and get them out the door for school. So it really helps make a transition period.
Yes, definitely. And I've even known some people that maybe struggle with the transition where it feels like, okay, when's enough time? Have I been sitting with this channel long enough? And so I've had some folks, they set timers on their phones. Like, I'm going to allow myself 10 minutes or maybe even 2 minutes, wherever we can find that time. And then saying, okay, the timer's gone off. I've spent enough time with my grief. Now it's time to change the channel, and it's time to get ready for work, or it's time to move on to the next task of living.
Yes, I had somebody recently tell me that she made a reflection, sit with your grief playlist. So it's about 4 songs, because that was about 10 minutes for her. And that's just sitting with that relaxing music, allowing her, if she's coloring or looking at pictures or just, reflecting on memories. And then that's kind of her cue when the playlist stops to change the channel to go to something else. And so really what we need to know is that we have the power. We have the power to change the channels whenever we want to or whenever we need to. And so really, for all of those that you are listening, is really looking at your hand, imagining that remote control. You have the remote. You can change your channels. So again, kind of like what you said, Hannah, is identifying what your channels are, identifying some channels you'd like to add to them, and then realizing that you can change those channels.
Certainly, and knowing they aren't going away. If you need to switch back, if it's the middle of the night or it's this or that, and saying to yourself, this is going to be here for me in the morning. I can switch to the peace channel. So I encourage you to really talk to your support people about this channel idea. Talk to them about maybe you, as you would if there's a new show. I know, Angela, we send show recommendations back and forth all the time, right? And that's a good way to talk to your loved ones, maybe other grievers that are in your world that you're grieving together. And then maybe starting a list of your favorite channels that help you, your peace channel, your mountain biking channel, like we talked about. And then maybe even making a list of some of those really valuable channels to visit when you have the time and the capacity.
I think that's a really important part, is thinking about sitting down and writing it down and then sharing it with your support person. Because again, we hear from so many people who are supporting grievers, I want to do the right thing. I want to know how to help. And this is a great place to start with just talking to them about channels, because you're right. We all talk about what are our favorite shows, what we're watching these days. And so let's talk about what our grief thoughts and the thoughts that are coming at us, and kind of thinking about them like channels.
Well, I enjoyed so much talking about channels today. I think it's a really helpful coping skill. And like we said, you got to pick it up and use it. The first time it might not be the most effective you've ever used a coping skill, but as you continue that practice, we've seen it be very, very helpful for many folks.
Listeners, if you want to know more about racing thoughts, or if you would like help walking through a thought channel-changing activity, we have a great YouTube episode that will lead you through an activity of what we've just been talking about here today. So you can find that on our YouTube page, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. It's titled Coping Skills Toolbox Number 2, Racing Thoughts. Most importantly, remember, when you're thinking about coping skills, imagine your coping skills toolbox. Remember, we all have to have tools. None of us know how to do this. So we have to collect and gather tools for our toolbox. But we don't want to just put them away. Pull them out, use them, practice them, try them. If it doesn't work, that's the great thing about a toolbox. There's another one in there to pull out and try. But also remember this important piece we've talked about today as well, sharing with a trusted person. Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. That's angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.